There are stories where the facts are still developing, and then there are stories where the first confirmed facts are already devastating. This is one of those stories. A preliminary U.S. military investigation now indicates that an American strike likely hit an elementary school in southern Iran during the opening hours of the war. The school was in Minab, near the Strait of Hormuz. It was not an abstract location on a map. It was a place where children were supposed to be learning. And according to the reporting that has emerged so far, the strike may have happened because old targeting information was still being treated as current. That is the center of this story. Not rumor, not a viral claim, not a dramatic theory built for clicks. A preliminary Pentagon-linked finding says the school appears to have been hit as part of a strike package aimed at an adjacent Iranian military site, after outdated intelligence data appears to have identified the area incorrectly. And when President Trump was asked about that reporting, his answer was, "I don't know about it." That answer matters because this is not a minor battlefield dispute. This is potentially one of the deadliest civilian casualty events of the war so far. The numbers reported publicly vary across outlets, and that matters too. Some reports cite at least 165 civilians killed. Iranian officials have put the toll higher, with most of the dead reported to be children. So before this goes any further, let's be precise. The full death toll is still being reported differently across sources, and the investigation is still ongoing. But even at the most cautious end of the reporting, the scale of the tragedy is enormous. And that means this story is about three things at once. First, what likely happened in Minab. Second, how an elementary school could still be sitting inside military targeting logic years after the site had changed. And third, what it means when public statements from the highest level do not seem to match the direction of the evidence. Let's start with the strike itself. The school at the center of this story is Shajara Tayyebe Elementary School in Minab, in Iran's Hormozgan province. It sits near an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval facility. That proximity is important because multiple reports now say the school building had once been part of a larger military compound years ago. Historical imagery, reviewed by journalists, indicates that at some point the site was separated from the adjacent base. Fences were added. Access points changed. Features consistent with the school became visible. In other words, the area appears to have evolved, but some part of the targeting process may not have evolved with it. That is the preliminary picture. According to the reporting, U.S. Central Command developed strike coordinates using data associated with the Defense Intelligence Agency. The emerging concern is that this information was outdated and that the school building was still being treated, somewhere in the system, as part of an Iranian military site. If that is ultimately confirmed, then this was not just a weapons story, it was a data story. And that distinction matters, because when most people hear about a precision-guided missile, they assume precision means certainty. But precision only describes what a weapon can do after a target has been selected. It does not guarantee that the target itself was correctly identified. A weapon can fly exactly where it was sent and still produce a catastrophic result if the underlying coordinates, assumptions, or verification process are wrong. That seems to be the question hanging over this entire case. Was the strike inaccurate, or was it accurate against the wrong target? That is a brutal difference, because one points to weapons failure, the other points to process failure. And process failures are often harder to confront because they travel through layers of bureaucracy: intelligence coding, target packages, command review, verification standards, legal review, strike authorization, battle rhythm, wartime tempo. No single headline can capture all of that, but the consequence is very easy to understand. If an elementary school was wrongly treated as a military target, then every missed opportunity to update, verify, challenge, or pause that assumption became part of the chain that led to the strike. That is why the story is so serious. And it is also why the public language around it matters. In the first days after the attack, the administration pushed back hard against the idea that the United States was responsible. Statements emphasized that the United States does not target civilians. Reports of the death toll were dismissed in some quarters as propaganda. President Trump even suggested at one point that Iran might be responsible, while also making comments about Tomahawk missiles that drew immediate scrutiny because Tomahawks are not weapons Iran is known to operate. Then came the reporting that the preliminary investigation was pointing back toward the United States. And then came Trump's answer: "I don't know about it." Now, to be fair, ongoing investigations do change. Preliminary findings are not final findings. Responsible reporting requires saying that clearly. There are still unanswered questions. Officials themselves have said the inquiry is not complete. It may take months. There may be more interviews, more imagery analysis, more internal review, and more scrutiny of who knew what and when. But that does not make the current reporting unimportant. It makes it more important. Because when an investigation is still in progress, that is exactly when disciplined public communication matters most. You do not fill the gap with claims that outrun the evidence. You do not throw out blame in directions that do not fit the known weapons picture. And you do not casually create confusion around who may have carried out a strike when the emerging record is moving the other way. This is one reason the phrase, "I don't know about it," lands so heavily here. If the commander-in-chief truly had not been briefed, that raises one set of concerns. If he had been broadly aware of the investigation, but not of its latest reported direction, that raises another. And if he was publicly behind the internal picture, while the public conversation was still being shaped by denial and deflection, that raises yet another. None of those possibilities is reassuring. Now step back and look at the mechanics of how this could have happened. Military targeting in fast-moving wars is not one person looking at one screen and pressing one button. It is a chain. Intelligence agencies classify sites. Analysts prepare data. Commands build strike packages. Satellite imagery may be checked. Legal and operational judgments are made. Units execute. After the strike, analysts review effects. That is the system people are now examining. And one of the most disturbing parts of the reporting is not just that old information may have existed, it is that old information may not have been caught. Because outdated data by itself is not unusual in intelligence work. Databases contain legacy information all the time. Buildings change use, compounds are restructured, fronts, fences, ownership, and functions shift. The protection against that is not pretending old data never exists. The protection is verification. That means current imagery, cross-checking, challenging assumptions, asking whether a site that once had military significance still has that status, asking what is next to it, asking who is there at that hour, asking what signs of civilian life are visible, asking whether a school, clinic, or public building has been walled off, repainted, repurposed, or open to the public. If those kinds of safeguards were weakened, rushed, or deprioritized, then this incident becomes about much more than one location in Manab. It becomes about whether the system was built to move fast, but not carefully enough. And that concern is already part of the wider reporting. Critics have pointed to the scaling back of some civilian harm mitigation efforts inside the Pentagon under Hegseth. That does not prove causation in this case, but it does sharpen the question. When civilian protection mechanisms are reduced, what happens when the pressure of wartime speed collides with flawed or stale information? This is where the story stops being only about Iran. Because any military that relies on data-heavy targeting should take this seriously. The more modern the strike system becomes, the more everyone wants to believe the machine is cleaner, smarter, and safer than the old model. But data confidence can create its own danger. If a label survives in a database longer than reality, and if nobody in the chain stops to interrogate it, then the result can look precise on paper right up until civilians die. That is why this case cuts so deeply. The phrase precision strike sounds clinical. What happened in Manab does not. The visuals coming out afterward were not technical. They were human. Rubble, smoke, families, funerals, shock, grief, and a school that, by multiple public accounts, was operating as a school. That does not mean every public claim made in wartime should be accepted automatically. It should not. Casualty numbers in conflict zones must always be handled carefully. Images must be verified. Videos must be geolocated. Official claims must be tested. But what makes this story so hard to dismiss is that the evidence did not move toward ambiguity as more reporting came out. It moved toward greater alignment. Video analysis, satellite reviews, munitions analysis, and reporting from multiple major outlets all began to point in the same broad direction. A U.S. strike likely hit the area, and the most credible emerging explanation was some form of targeting error tied to outdated information. That convergence matters because sometimes there is a fog of war story where 10 theories compete. This does not look like that anymore. It looks like a narrowing story. And if that narrowing story holds, then the next question becomes accountability. Who coded the site? Who reviewed the site? Who signed off? Who failed to notice that the building's status had changed? Who had access to newer imagery? Who was responsible for verifying the coordinates before the strike package moved forward? And after the strike, who said what publicly before the facts were clear? Those are not side questions. Those are the core questions. Because if this ends with nothing more than a mistake was made, then the public learns almost nothing. Serious accountability is not just admitting error in the abstract. It is identifying where the chain failed and whether the failure reflected one-off negligence, structural weakness, or a broader culture problem. And culture matters here. There has been rhetoric from senior officials about rejecting stupid rules of engagement and not allowing excessive caution to get in the way of operational effectiveness. Supporters hear that and think strength. Critics hear that and worry about what happens when restraint is treated as weakness rather than discipline. This story is why that debate matters in real life. Because caution is not softness when children are inside a building. Verification is not bureaucracy for its own sake when the cost of getting it wrong is irreversible. Civilian harm prevention is not decorative language for press briefings. It is supposed to be an operating principle. If it becomes secondary, the results do not stay secondary. They become headlines like this one. And then there is the political layer. Trump's role here is not just that he gave a dismissive-sounding answer. It is that his public comments earlier in the story appear to have moved away from where the evidence was going. That creates a credibility problem. In wartime, the public already knows governments do not reveal everything immediately. But there is a difference between withholding comment pending an investigation and improvising claims that may later collapse under the evidence. That difference matters for trust. If the public starts to believe that battlefield truth is being shaped around political convenience rather than evidence, then every later statement becomes harder to believe, even when it is true. That is one of the deepest costs of a case like this. The physical damage is immediate. The credibility damage can last much longer. And for the families of the victims, even that discussion can feel painfully abstract. Because while officials debate target coding, intelligence workflows, and preliminary findings, families are left with absence. Children who were in class do not come home. Teachers do not come home. A school day becomes a funeral week. No amount of technical explanation changes the human reality at the center of that. That is why language matters so much. A story like this should not be turned into a spectacle. It should not be inflated beyond the evidence. And it should not be softened below the evidence either. The truth, as best it can be stated right now, is already heavy enough. A preliminary U.S. investigation reportedly indicates that an American strike likely hit an elementary school in Manab because outdated targeting information treated the location as part of an adjacent Iranian military site. Public casualty counts differ, but the reported death toll is extremely high, and many of the dead were children. The investigation is ongoing. President Trump, when asked about the reporting, said he did not know about it. Those are the points that hold. And from those points, several conclusions follow. First, the final findings of the investigation matter enormously. Second, the public should be skeptical of any title, script, or commentary that claims more certainty than the evidence supports. Third, even the cautious version of this story is damning enough to demand scrutiny. And fourth, if the underlying problem really was stale intelligence combined with failed verification, then this was not a random tragedy. It was a preventable one. That may be the hardest sentence in this entire story. Not that something terrible happened in war, but that, based on the reporting so far, it may have happened through a chain of decisions and non-decisions that should have been designed to stop exactly this outcome. That is why the story does not end with the strike. It ends, or should end, with whether the system changes, whether the full findings are released, whether responsibility is assigned honestly, whether civilian protection is treated as central rather than optional, whether commanders, analysts, and political leaders are held to the same factual standard they expect everyone else to follow, and whether the public is told the truth, even when the truth is costly. Because if the worst thing a government can say after a story like this is we don't know yet, the second worst thing is acting as if the truth is whatever is most convenient until the paperwork catches up. A school was hit. Children were killed. The investigation reportedly points toward a U.S. strike and a targeting failure tied to outdated intelligence. That is where the story stands. And unless the final evidence overturns the current direction entirely, this will be remembered not just as a battlefield tragedy, but as a warning about what happens when modern military precision outruns modern military accountability. That is the real story here, not just who fired, not just who said what afterward, but whether a system built to look exact was actually careful enough to deserve the word.